Okay, everybody, what are you thinking of convention so far? I wasn't supposed to be up here, but our itinerary has been moved around, and sometimes every rose has its thorn, not because you get to hear from me, but as a lot of you know, Secretary Rollins was supposed to come here, but due to scheduling, she couldn't come. And that's so disappointing in one way because I think that she needed to visit with you. She needs you to hear from you, the real producers, you know, as much as we were anxious to hear from her. But there is a bright side. The fact that she was going to come and that she had to reschedule shows maybe a more open door than we've ever had before to the Secretary of Agriculture, because we know that the USDA is the biggest agency in our government. It's at the center of almost every issue that we have. It couldn't solve it, but it could move it towards resolution. And so I think that going forward, that's going to be good. So that's why I'm up here introducing Bill, the man that needs no introduction, right? But to do that, the board wanted me to just say a few words up here before we get going on Bill. The comment that I hear from a lot of people here today, because I love to walk around and visit with you, what I hear is, where's the good news? Right? Where's the good news? Guys, this organization doesn't exist to talk about fluff and to have this big party. This big party is not the point of this. The point of this is to talk about the issues that are at our feet and the issues that are on the horizon. And that's the speakers that you've been hearing from here today. These guys are the patriots that are looking out for us and moving forward. So that's the good news. The good news is that we're still here. In an industry that's been shrinking, RCAF is still here and we're still strong. And we've held our numbers, and we're starting to get big. And I think the best part is, what I love the most about RCAF, what drew me to it, it's kind of like Heather Maud standing up here saying, we were not promised an easy existence. Those are powerful words. You'll figure that out. Every one of us will figure that out in our lives before we're done. But the thing is, what drew me to RCAF, it isn't, I saw it in the mods. They didn't, when they got in trouble and they got down, they didn't try to get God on their side. Their first step was they got themselves on God's side, right, for the power to fight. And RCAF is much the same. The analogy that I want to make is that RCAF starts on America's side, and we're trying to get America back. We're not trying to change America. We're not trying to water it down. All we want is those fundamental promises that we were given. What's more good news? There's a lot of young people here. There's a lot of people that have never been here before that are at this conference, and that's why it's so great that we're going to have Bill. More good news. I sold yearlings last week and Wednesday, and they set the state record for 9-weight yearlings. Second highest price yearlings in the United States, and more good news is that record lasted about 3 days. Right? We have a good cattle market. We need to be happy about that, but we need to take that happiness and take that treasure and turn it into a commitment to keep that market, because we need it, because everything that we buy is record price too. When I sat at that sale, if you haven't been to a sale and you haven't sat through a sale, it was in Platte, South Dakota. They sell everything from baby calves to weigh cows to light weaned calves, unweaned calves to big yearlings. And I sat there that whole day, and the only thing that could go through my head was America loves beef. You see, I thought, up to this point, I thought that we were in a rally of attrition. We had shrunk our cow herd so much that the market had no choice to go up. But the fact that it's kept going up and the fact that the consumers have kept buying it shows that America loves beef. So what I want to do here, my point here right now, is I would love all of you to stand up and give a huge hand to the American consumer, because that's who we all work for. That's who, the hardworking men and women of America that choose beef to feed their families and buy what we create. That's why we're all here, and that's who we serve. And a big part of RCAF's thrust is that the people that have gotten in between that consumer and us people that grow the cattle are the problem. So I want to show you a picture. Guys, if you could put that first picture up. That's what I think of when I think of RCAF. I was driving out and I was thinking about the theme. The theme is all in. Look at that picture and look close. And that's a random picture of thousands of pictures, but they all show the same thing. Is that all in? Can you imagine selling everything you had and buying a wagon and loading your very most precious possessions up and heading west? Taking your wife, taking your kids. What don't you see in that picture? You don't see very many of the men. Where are they at? They're out on the ridges. They're watching to see what's forward so that these wagons could make their way west. I mean, and then as Shad Sullivan would say, where there's beef, there's freedom. What'd they take with them? They took their ready-made meal kit. The cattle that they could milk. They could eat the grass on the way. The oxen that they could butcher if things got tough. And so to me, that is what I think of when I think about you, because you're the descendants of them. You know what you're fighting for. You know how hard this is. These people were not guaranteed an easy existence. But why did they head west? What were they looking for? They were looking for land. They were looking for opportunity. They weren't looking for a living. They were looking for a life. And that's what we've got. Next slide. How about those guys? We live in the middle of these two pictures. People that were all in to create a life, and people that were all in to preserve one. Everybody, I'm a bohemian, self-proclaimed. I love impossible tasks, but I look at everything backwards. It's kind of like looking in a mirror. What do you think of when you look at that boat? That's a Higgins boat. Normandy just celebrated the anniversary of that. I can't remember what year. Everybody says, how did they get off that boat? But I don't think that. What got them on that boat? Love of country. And so that's what I've got to say about RCAF. I think we are undoubtedly the most pro-America group out here. We're not trying to get America on our side. We're on America's side, and we're trying to get America back to what it needs to be. And so while others may have common ground summits, I think this is a stand your ground summit. And that leads me to a guy that stood his ground for a long time. If I could think of one thing that Bill Bullard has written that makes me think of him, it was when we were looking for a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. And the requirement was one line: must be able to resist the human tendency to conform. Because the world will come at you and everybody will tell you the world is changing. Things are different. It's not your grandpa and grandma's world anymore. You got to change. You got to go with this. And some of that is true. But you better hold on to your fundamental American rights, because that's what it's about. And that's what Bill Bullard, we've talked about future threats. We've talked about threats at our doorstep. We've heard from people like Heather and Charles that didn't pick the fight picked them. But I guess Bill Bullard has been here since the beginning, and he will show you the problem, and he will show you the solution. And if we leave here fired up and we don't do anything, it's been the most tremendous failure ever, with the biggest convention we've ever had, because we got to get going, because this is a timed event. So take some membership brochures, tell your neighbors. Last thing I want to say, Jack Payne's a USCA member, but he and I agree on a lot of things. And he put on a post, he said, the reason we're not getting anywhere, on a Facebook post, he said, the reason we're not getting anywhere is I've got X amount of customers at my livestock dealer, hit my livestock auction. 90% of them believes with everything RCAF does, and none of them are members. We need to have members. That's where the power comes from. And so to those of you that are members and those of you that do show up, thank you. And here's Bill Bullard.
There we go. Two prefatory items. First is when you're engaged in a long-term fight and your progress seems to be quite meager, human tendency is to start looking for shiny things. Hence the discussion that Tracy Hunt gave this morning. And the other thing is you've got the highest nominal prices in history. Brett just beat a record. Why in the world, then, would we be talking about a persistent cattle crisis? And so I want to talk to you about your industry and explain to you why this is a serious crisis that your industry is in. So for an industry to be successful like yours, the U.S. cattle industry, you're going to need a competitive infrastructure. And if you want to know what that is, it includes the participants in the industry, you. It includes your cattle, the mother cow herd. It includes the intermediary marketing outlets available for you to market your production. It requires beef packing plants, and it requires competition. And if we go back just over a generation ago, we had 1.3 million of you, beef cattle operations. We had 37 million mother cows in the U.S. cattle herd. We had over 113,000 intermediary marketing outlets, the feedlots. We had over 1,400 federally inspected meatpacking plants, and they slaughtered 32 million cattle. And we had 4 largest packers controlling only 36% of the market. So that was just over a generation ago. And the way this works is when a consumer, those who you just congratulated, when the consumer goes to the grocery store and buys a steak and purchases that steak at the checkout counter, then for every dollar that that consumer spent has got to go back upstream in the supply chain, and it has to be allocated amongst everybody who made a contribution to that steak product. And so in your industry, back over a generation ago, when a consumer went to the grocery store and spent $1, that dollar was then distributed, allocated upstream in the supply chain, and the retailer and packer got 37 cents, and you, the producer, the live cattle producer, from the cow-calf producer to the backgrounder to the feeder, you shared 63 cents. You were the majority recipient of every dollar that consumers spent on beef just a little over a generation ago. Move ahead to today. We've lost over half of all beef cattle operations that were in business just over a generation ago. We've lost over 9 million mother cows out of our factory. We've eliminated 86,000 independent feedlots, primarily the smaller feedlots. We lost 77% of the feedlots in business just over a generation ago. We've lost 45% of all the federally inspected meat packing plants during that short 4-decade period. And that left us with a market concentration of 4 packers controlling 81% of the market. And interestingly, we're still slaughtering about 32 million head of cattle. Same number of cattle we were slaughtering 40 years ago. And so if we look at 40 years from 1980, you received 63 cents of every consumer beef dollar. We jump ahead 40 years, and suddenly you, the cattle producer, are now the minority recipient of the consumer beef dollar that's allocated upstream in the supply chain. In 2001, it was the packers and the retailers who received the 63 cents, and you, the producer, received only 37 cents. That is a complete reversal. We tipped it on its head, the share of the consumer beef dollar that went back to the producer. Well, how did that happen? Well, we rely on the invisible hand of competition. We don't rely on any regulations or policy or statute that says each segment of the supply chain is supposed to get X percent. We relied on a competitive marketplace. It was the competitive market forces that properly allocated that share of the consumer beef dollar to you. 63 cents back in 1980, and suddenly in 2001, it's flipped on its head. You're the minority recipient, and you're only receiving 37 cents. How does that happen in a competitive marketplace? If it's competitive market forces that allocated properly every beef dollars consumers spent back over a generation ago, how can it happen today in a competitive marketplace? It cannot. You can't reverse, upend the share that a competitive marketplace was allocating into the supply chain in a competitive marketplace. What does that tell us? That tells us that something is interfering with the competitive marketplace. very quickly, if we look at, well, what does the structure of our industry look like? We look at the bottom of this pyramid, we have over 622,000 cow-calf producers and backgrounders and stockers at the base of this industry, the market structure. Then we move up to the black lines, the demarcation points of the feedlot sector. Now we only have about 26,000 feedlots left. So the 25 million cattle working its way up from the cow-calf producer up to the feedlot, after that animal is fed, it's ultimately sold to 4 packers that control over 81% of the marketplace. And again, the number of feedlots, that's bottleneck now with only 26,000 feeders. So that's the structure of the industry that we have today, an extreme bottleneck at the downstream segment where your animals first are going to the feedlot. We have a high concentration there, and then even higher concentration when those 80% of those 25 million cattle are slaughtered by just 4 packers. What has happened is decades of denial, inattention, and neglect have rendered your cattle industry's structure untenable, unsustainable. It's systemically, fundamentally broken, and we need to change it. So why did it happen? It happened for 2 reasons primarily: concentration and globalization. Now, concentration started back in the 1980s when we went through merger mania, where we lost those 1,400 federally inspected plants, lost 45% of them. The 4 largest packers suddenly captured 2 years ago, 85% of the marketplace. And they were satisfied with the U.S. Department of Agriculture to engage in what has been viewed as the great consumer welfare experiment. And that was despite the fact that the U.S. Department of Agriculture has a statutory duty to support and promote and protect America's family-scale farming and ranching operation. They ignored all that. They ignored it and substituted it with this consumer welfare experiment, which essentially said this, and that was that even if a proposed rule or a proposed policy would cause financial harm to the very producers that the U.S. Department of Agriculture is supposed to protect, so long as that harm is offset by benefits to consumers, the USDA would support it. And we saw that happen. USDA had a policy for many, many years and said that imports of a commodity serve to increase social welfare. To the extent that the consumer choice is broadened and the price of products is cheapened, there's a huge gain for consumers if we just facilitate more imports into this country. And that has been the USDA policy for decades. And the result, or an example of how the USDA knowingly proposed a policy, supported a policy that they knew was going to cause your industry, in this case, $24 million in damage. That was the rule to allow fresh beef from Paraguay, a country where foot and mouth disease remains endemic. And nevertheless, the USDA decided they were going to go forward with the rule, allow the additional products in. Again, the theory was they'd allow the additional products in, more choices for consumers, prices would decline, and consumers would benefit. And oh yeah, the additional supplies are going to cause 24 million in injury to you. Previously, they did this with Brazil, and they calculated that the U.S. producer would be harmed by the amount of $165 million. Nevertheless, they went forward on this policy because it met their global objective of trying to facilitate more imports into the United States. And what has happened during the process over the last 4 decades is the meat packers were very strategic, very smart. They realized that if they could capture the voice of producers, they could begin to formulate a policy structure and a regulatory structure that would benefit their self-interest. So what did they do? Back in the 80s and 90s, they infiltrated all of the conventional producer groups. National Cattlemen's Beef Association has beef packers seated on their governing board. National Pork Producer Council as well. National Chicken Council as well. And what they did was they were able to persuade all the policymakers that what was good for the packing industry was good for the producers because we're all in this together. Anyone not hear that? What's good for the packers has to be good for the producers because we're all in this together. We're all a part of the same supply chain. And Congress and the administration, the executive branch, bought this hook, line, and sinker. And then after promoting the policy positions, one of the things that they did by formulating a policy framework with it, which benefited their interests, the way they achieved this was they deleted the policies that were protecting independent producers. They refused to implement the Packers and Stockyards Act, for example, never wrote rules to implement that. They weakened our food safety standards, the standards that were protecting, that were ensuring that the product competing against you in your own domestic market was at least meeting the same standards. It wasn't long after we entered the World Trade Organization in 1995, one of the first things the U.S. Department of Agriculture did was they relaxed the requirement that foreign countries had to have food safety systems at least equal to that of the United States. Problem was, is these developing countries could not meet the high standards of the United States. When a country can't meet the high standards, but you want their product, what must you do? Lower your standards. And that's precisely what the U.S. Department of Agriculture did back in the mid-1990s. And as a result, foreign countries no longer have to meet your standard, a standard that is equal to yours. Now it only needs to be close enough. And the close enough standard is called equivalency. It also used to be that we required these foreign beef packing plants to have our USDA federal inspector go down there and physically inspect their meat packing plant to ensure that the documentation they provided was accurate. We did that on a monthly basis up until we entered the World Trade Organization with globalization, and after that determined, well, that was just too much of a burden on these poor little developing countries' meat packing plants. Now we've relaxed that requirement. Now we only require periodic inspections of those plants. And so the concentration that occurred in the 80s, allowing the meat packers to capture a dominant position in the marketplace and to exert abusive buying power upon livestock sellers, soon after that occurred, the concentration occurred, then we jumped headfirst into globalization. And it started in 1994 when we entered the North American Free Trade Agreement, and then it was memorialized in 1995 when we entered the World Trade Organization. And so what had happened was, through history, we have purposely tried to open our borders to help developing countries by providing them market access for their beef, because they could produce beef. And so we, after the war, World War II, we went through the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade back in 1947, and then we've had several rounds since then. And the rounds called the Tokyo Round in the 60s and 70s made it a concerted effort that the United States would try to facilitate more imports into the country from these other countries. Then in 1994, when we entered the Uruguay round, we specifically said that the purpose of the agreement, the international trade agreement, the purpose was to provide export opportunities for foreign countries that had a comparative advantage. What a comparative advantage means is they can produce cheaper than you can. Paraguay and Brazil and Argentina with year-round grass have a comparative advantage. Their production cost is about half of that of yours. And so what happened is, under the theory that we would provide these developing countries with an opportunity to export their product to the United States, and once they were to build their domestic economies, soon they would become buyers of our export beef, and everybody would win. Remember the win-win comments that Brian O'Shaughnessy talked to us yesterday. It was going to be a win-win situation, give these countries that have a comparative advantage access to the U.S. market. But what happened is that import volumes far exceeded expectations, and export volumes couldn't keep up. So we were outpaced with imports, and as a result, we began to realize the trade deficit. And then even though these countries were not reciprocating, Australia, Brazil, for example, that we import a lot of beef from, they're not buying beef from the United States of any quantities, and so it's a one-way street. And nevertheless, we maintained the course. We continued to lower our tariffs, lower our tariff rate quotas, and actually invite these lower cost products into the United States. So concentration resulted in the dismantling of the competitive infrastructure, the reduction of number of participants, the reduction of the number of our cows in the beef cow herd, the number of our feedlots, and the number of packing plants. And And as a result, our industry has shrunk. And as it shrank, we embarked on this globalization effort. And what that has done is it eliminated opportunities, particularly for new entrants to enter this U.S. market. Now, there's a microcosm example, a model that we can look at and say this applies to the entire United States. It just so happens that up in the Pacific Northwest, in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, those 4 states they're somewhat self-contained. They import from Canada and Mexico. They have feedlots. They have a couple packing plants up there. And if we look at just how that section of the United States operates, we can then apply it universally to the rest of the United States. So if we look at those 3 states, what we find is the meatpacking industry and the National Cattlemen's Beef Association said that the 282,000 head of fed cattle and feeder cattle that were being imported into that region on an annual basis, those animals were needed in order to offset the seasonal shortages that their feedlots were experiencing and to ensure that the feedlots and the packing plants would operate at optimal levels. That was the justification for allowing 282,000 head of cattle in every year. And in a U.S. International Trade Commission hearing in 2018, the U.S. or the meat packers and the NCBA testified to this. And so I went home and looked at what has happened in the Pacific Northwest since since 1994 when we entered NAFTA, as a result of importing annually 282,000 head of live cattle from Canada and Mexico into that region. The effect was this: we displaced domestic production in those 3 states almost on the equivalency of the volume of cattle that we were importing from Canada and Mexico, live cattle. We lost 36% of all the beef cattle operations in those 3 states just since we entered NAFTA in 1994, and we've lost 300,000 mother cows out of that region's factory. So it's clear that these imports have the effect of displacing domestic production in the United States. And so we have spent decades calling for investigations by the U.S. International Trade Commission, by the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, to the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee, to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, to the U.S. Department of Justice. We recently asked for an investigation regarding the erroneous report of a screw fly outbreak in Missouri here recently. And so we have a long history of calling for investigations. Well, as a result of us calling for investigations, others began to too. And in 2021, Senator Mike Rounds and Senator Smith from Minnesota joined in a letter that 28 members of Congress signed, and they sent a letter to the the United States Attorney General and asked for an investigation, and they said this in their letter. They said what it appears is that every time that the price rallies in the United States benefiting domestic cattle producers, it appears that the meat packers increase the volume of imports coming into the United States. So we tracked that over a 10-year period, starting in 2015, and we show there that this chart is showing the blue graph represents the monthly volume of beef imports into the United States on a monthly basis. The red line represents fed cattle prices. So you can see during this period here that whenever we had a price rally, we would see a corresponding increase in the monthly volume of imports coming into this country. Was that a coincidence? The 28 members of Congress said that's suspicious. There's a correlation between rising prices and increasing imports coming in from foreign countries. So here was the fall in 2015 of fed cattle prices. And then here we are, 16, 17, 18, 19. We hit the drought in the latter part of 2020. Cattle prices start to increase. But look at the overall volume. Imports have significantly increased. Why are they increasing? It's an effort to leverage down the prices that your cattle are responding to with the latent forces of competition that still exist in the marketplace. And so let's look at how we know that this industry is still in crisis. We saw this chart earlier. This is a chart that has been used, quite widespread use of this chart. including in our antitrust litigation. And as the Assistant Attorney General last year said at our convention for the Department of Justice, he said when he saw this chart, he realized that there was an anti-competitive problem here, that this was an antitrust violation. What that chart shows is that the blue represents, there we go. The blue represents the price that consumers are willing to pay for beef. So essentially measuring consumer consumption demand and willingness to pay more. The red line, again, is overlaid as your fed cattle prices. So we saw from 2010 through 2014, we hit a drought in 2011 to 13. We saw consumer willingness to pay more for beef was increasing. And there was a positive correlation, which you would expect. As consumers paid more for beef, your fed cattle prices started to increase. Then we hit the latter part of 2014, and every analyst, government and private alike, said that you were going to receive higher prices for the next 3 years because of the long biological cycle of cattle. It would take you 3 years to begin expanding your cattle herd. That was in the latter part of 2014. But inexplicably, cattle prices collapsed. It collapsed further and faster than any time in history. Until October 2016, we were under $100, and then they tried to recover, and then suddenly cattle prices started stair-stepping downward for multiple years, and when doing so, retail prices that consumers were paying were stair-stepping upwards. So instead of having a positive correlation, a harmonious relationship between your fed cattle prices and retail beef prices, which you would expect because the only ingredient in beef is cattle, so it made sense for decades that this operated this way, but suddenly there was a departure and it did not recover until we hit another widespread drought, shrinking our herd size down to the smallest level in over 7 decades. And as a result, the latent forces of competition were unleashed and your fed cattle prices started to increase. Meanwhile, retail consumer beef prices continued to escalate, and we still remain an exceptionally wide spread between retail prices and cattle prices. Here's a chart if you thought that perhaps this was somewhat of an isolated period only starting in 2010. Well, here's one that goes back all the way to 1990, 30 years of data showing you the same thing, that we have never in the history of our industry seen such an inverse relationship between fed cattle prices and retail prices, except that what happened in 2015 through 2021, actually. That tells us something's wrong with the industry. The industry is fundamentally broken when the economic forces do not allow your industry to function as the economics would inform you that they would. And if we look at our sister sheep industry, for example, we go back 2010 and we can see here the sheep industry, like the cattle industry, saw an increased price for their lambs that suddenly collapsed, and then they went for several years and remained relatively stable. And then we had another shot increase, the highest nominal prices in history at this point, and then again, a sudden collapse, and then they struggled to survive, and now they are depressed. So now we go back to our cattle industry, and we ask the question then, we have the same thing. I'm having trouble with this thing. We have the same thing. We've got the spike in increase in prices in 2013, 14, and then 15, a collapse. Here we were falling somewhat, but still relatively stable. Now prices are going up. So the question is, where will they go from here? Now, so what wasn't here that is here? What's different about the marketplace? What was different back then, or what wasn't in existence back then, but is now? It's called one of the largest multi-district antitrust lawsuits in the history of your industry. We filed a lawsuit because there was no explanation for the collapse in cattle prices but for the alleged antitrust violations that we included in our lawsuit against the largest packers. So, sheep industry, and here's just the black line here represents over time the value of lambs. The red line represents the monthly volume of imports. You can see the same thing. And the imports in the sheep industry have absolutely decimated the commercial industry. So now we're looking at the loss of beef cattle operations. I told you we had 1.3 million over a generation ago. We're now down to 622,000. We've lost over half of every cattle producer, or half of the cattle producers in business just over a generation ago. They're gone today. That is a long-term downward trend. That was not caused by a isolated disease outbreak, was not caused by an isolated drought, was not caused by a series of isolated droughts. This is a long-term systemic trend. And an economist can look at that and say, I can predict the future. I can tell you exactly the direction the number of your beef cattle operations are going if you don't change the structure of the U.S. cattle industry, even though today you're receiving the highest nominal prices in history. And what's going to happen to your cattle industry if we don't change the structure of the industry? You will continue to see fewer and fewer beef cattle producers. That means your children are going to have a heck of a time taking over the operations. That means we're just going to have trouble filling that gap that the speaker yesterday from Iowa State University said the average age is now 58 years old. It's been getting older every census. So that's the direction our industry is going. Not just the cattle industry. We've lost over half of all of our beef cattle producers. We've lost 91% of all the hog farms, 89% of all the dairies, and 26% of the sheep producers in the United States over that same period. And now we look at the size of our mother cow herd, because we've all been told, well, we've been told a couple things. We've been told, one, yeah, we're down to the lowest numbers in over 7 decades, but we really don't need all those darn cows anymore because we're producing more beef on the hoof. We have improved genetics, improved managerial ability, we're feeding cattle longer, we're producing heavier carcasses. We just don't need all the cows, and we're still slaughtering the same number of cattle. But what's happened to the number of cattle? Long term, from 1980 to 2024, our industry has been on a steep decline in terms of numbers of cows. Again, an economist can predict the future and say, if you don't make any structural changes to this industry, we can predict what's happening with the number of cattle in your industry. And if we look at it over time, so we've all been told, well, we're in a cattle cycle. Indeed, we are in a cattle cycle. And here's cattle cycles from 1970 to 2024. So in 1975, we hit a peak in terms of the number of cattle in the U.S. cattle inventories. So up here is total cattle, down here is our mother cow herd. So in 75, we hit a peak. 1982 was the start of the last normal cattle cycle that usually lasts 6 to 7 years herd expansion, 1 to 2 years of consolidation, 3 to 4 years of liquidation, we start all over again. The last one of those normal cycles was here. And ever since then, we've been stair-stepping downwards to reduce the size of the U.S. cattle herd. Again, not caused by an isolated disease outbreak, climatic condition, or any other factor. This is a systemic problem built into the structures of our industry. Here's the loss of our feedlot operations. We had 113,000 feedlots back in the 80s. And then they have been precipitously declining. We're now down to 26,000. We've wiped out over 86,000 of our small farmer feeders. They used to be sitting in your auction yards bidding for your cattle. And USDA keeps track of feeding profits, returns to cattle feeding in the United States. I just looked down. We got 1 minute and 24 seconds left. This chart shows same long-term downward trajectory. And that is a precipitous decline in the returns to cattle feeding in the United States. And the last chart I want to show you is this one. USDA keeps track of returns to per bred cow for cow-calf producers. This goes back all the way to 87. Right here you can see I pointed out where NAFTA was, where we entered globalization, and we saw we had very low returns per bred cow on a national basis. And then in the mid-2000s, for the first time in history, our cow-calf returns jumped up over $100 per bred cow per year. What happened back then? We had an anomaly. We had a shock to the system. We had BSE identified in the native Canadian herd. The U.S. closed its border. RCAF litigated, kept the border closed for over 2 years. We reduced about 5 or 6% of the volume of animals that were imported in the United States. That was enough to recharge the competitive forces, the latent forces in the marketplace. What happened when the border opened after July of 2007? excuse me, 2005, your returns per head cow collapsed almost immediately. And then we went on until we hit the drought again back in the 2010 to 13 period, and we saw our prices hit the highest nominal levels in history. We had a second shock, widespread drought throughout the southern part of the United States for sure, and now, as soon as the drought was over, a decline in returns per bred cow. And in 2022, the returns on a national basis per bred cow was $19 per bred cow per year. $19 per bred cow. That takes a lot of cows to feed a family of four in terms of profitability. And now 2023, high $213 returns per bred cow per year. We expect 2024 to be much higher. However, the structure of your industry remains unchanged, and here is the overall trade balance that we are dealing with in the world trade arena. Here we show on an annual basis from 1990 to 2024, the blue represents imports of beef and cattle from around the world into your U.S. market. The maroon represents the exports of U.S. beef to these foreign countries, and the red is the deficit. The red indicates the volume that is putting downward pressure on your prices. And as you can see, for this entire period, we have suffered under the weight of horrendous trade deficits with countries around the world. Let's look closer to home, to the countries that are called the most important trading partners for you. This is Canada and Mexico. And look at the trade balance between Canada and Mexico. Again, the blue on an annual basis are imports of beef and cattle from Canada and Mexico, and the maroon are our exports to those countries, and the red is the deficit. So look here. The last 2023, we were importing 3 times the volume of beef that we were exporting to Canada and Mexico. So this explains the chart here. If it weren't for the deficit that we are experiencing with Canada and Mexico, our world trade balance would be much improved, because it's the world trade balance with countries like Japan and South Korea, for example, that have mitigated some of the harm created by this trade. And this is a trade where for every $4 that we give to Canada and Mexico buying their beef and cattle, they give us $1 back, because we are exporting or a fourth of what we're importing to them. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. It's a third. This is stupid trade. And this is trade that can only be corrected by doing what Brian O'Shaughnessy told us, and that is to impose tariffs and tariff rate quotas on the industry in order to protect the industry, and the opportunity is greater now than ever before, because you have now reached a price point that should incentivize you to begin expanding your herd, that should incentivize aspiring ranchers to enter our industry. The reason we're not seeing this expansion of our herd happening as quickly as it should under these highest nominal prices in history is because nobody has confidence in the system. They understand that the entire market structure is broke and it has to be fixed. And I didn't even get to the point of, well, here's what we need to do to fix it. And so I'm asking you then to go to the front desk and look at our 5-year plan, in which we have identified the steps that need to be taken in order to correct this situation, to solve this problem. And we need to act quickly, because we need these cattle prices to remain at this higher price point to incentivize the growth. And then once that happens, we're going to generate more economic activity in rural communities, attract more young people, expand the existing herds. That's going to increase our rural economy. And by doing so, we will ultimately benefit consumers, because it will also increase competition. And what is the best means by which to ensure consumers have a fair and affordable supply of food? Have a competitive industry, which we do not now have. With that, thank you. I ran out of time, so we're going to stop. Thank you all.